Late 18th century Britain, it ruled the seas and was the world's foremost superpower. So how did the good men and women of the 13 original American colonies fight off the British behemoth and gain independence? We will take a look at what sparked this bloody war and just how those original freedom fighters won through after over 8 years battling the tyrant King George III and his attempt to keep the colonies within his clutches. It all began with the discovery of the New World. Who actually discovered this new and fertile land was in dispute for decades, but it now appears that the Vikings were the first Europeans to sail across the North Atlantic and land in North America in the 10th century, followed by Columbus in 1492. Of course, we have to recognize that the term discovered is relative, as these lands already had an indigenous population who themselves found their way to North America across the Bering Land Bridge thousands of years before any Europeans. These indigenous peoples suffered greatly from the arrival of the Europeans, who brought diseases over the Atlantic that the indigenous population had no defense to. They were also horrifically mistreated and almost wiped out as a people. This has to be recognized when we talk about the founding of the United States of America and indeed Canada and South America, where the same suffering was unleashed by the European conquerors. In the centuries that followed the European discovery of the Americas, there was a mad scramble for land between primarily England, France, Spain, and Portugal. Spain and Portugal focused their attention on South America, whilst the English and French battled over North America. By the time of the American War of Independence, the Spanish and Portuguese had split South America between themselves and were bleeding the continent dry of any gold they could get their hands on. The English were now part of Great Britain, and the 13 American colonies on the northeastern seaboard of North America established by England were now British colonies. The French had a larger presence in North America, with much of Canada and what is now the USA under their control. Britain's head of state was King George III, who had been on the British throne since 1760. The legacy of King George is rather interesting. Americans see him as a mad tyrant that inflicted financial hardship on the colonists, whereas the British see him as a kind-hearted, enlightened king. It's true that he suffered from mental illness, so mad isn't far from the truth. King George died in 1820 in a terrible way. His illness had made him blind, deaf, and broken. On the French throne sat King Louis XVI. By contrast, Louis XVI was incredibly unpopular in France. He was the last king of France, brought down in the French Revolution in 1789 and executed by the new French Republic in 1793. The French Queen Marie Antoinette was also executed by guillotine in 1793. What is called the French and Indian War was actually a war between Britain and France. It began in 1754 and ended with the Treaty of Paris. During this war, the British won battle after battle and ended up expelling the French from North America. After this war, an uneasy peace settled over the continent, with both countries spying on each other, hoping to get the upper hand should hostilities break out again. Around this time, Britain had a vast empire. Although not yet at its peak, it was impressive nonetheless. With India, Australia, New Zealand, and great swathes of Africa under British control. France similarly had an empire of its own, although not as impressive as the British Empire. They still had colonies all over the world, including most of West Africa. At this point, Britain was starting to struggle financially and looked to collect more money from its population through taxation. Britain was already heavily taxed, and it was thought that more taxes could cause civil unrest. So King George and his government looked to the American colonies. In comparison to Britain, it was thought that the colonies were relatively undertaxed. Over the next few years, the British Parliament implemented a string of new taxes on the colonists. On top of this, they attempted to make the collection of taxes more efficient, so much so that the very sight of the tax collectors filled the colonists with dread. One of these new taxes was the stamp tax, which was a tax on newspapers, court papers, gaming dice, and playing cards. In fact, every piece of paper used in the legal system and media. The American colonists reacted angrily to this tax, and protests started to spring up around the 13 colonies. Boycotts of British goods and public denouncements by American politicians were also used in an attempt to persuade King George to backtrack on the taxes. One of the taxes that was implemented was a tax on tea. In 1773 in Boston, tea was thrown into the sea in protest at the tax. This infamous event is known as the Boston Tea Party. Fighting began in April 1775 at the Battle of Lexington, which was more of a minor skirmish than a full-on battle, but nevertheless ignited the war. The British Parliament declared the colonies as being in a state of rebellion. The fledgling nation formally declared independence from Great Britain in 1776 in Philadelphia. From the very beginning, France supported the colonists financially. France had much to gain from the British losing the colonies. In 1778, the American colonies officially joined France in declaring war on the British globally and agreed to help defend the French West Indies. Spain also allied with the French in helping the colonists. The war raged on with over 230 battles or skirmishes between 1775 and 1783. The French provided supplies, arms and ammunition, uniforms, and, most importantly, troops and naval support to the beleaguered colonial army. The French Navy transported reinforcements, fought off a British fleet, and protected Washington's forces in Virginia. The British supply line stretched nearly 3,000 miles across an ocean. Adding to the resupply challenge were regular confrontations with French and U.S. Navy warships as well as privateers. Delays and disruptions proved costly to the British. At the climax of the war, British General Lord Cornwallis surrendered his army to American General George Washington and the colonial and French armies after the final battle of the Revolutionary War on October 19, 1781 in Yorktown, Virginia. Most people assume that this was the end of the war, and indeed it was at this point that the British knew it was over for them. But west of the Appalachian Mountains, the fighting would continue for almost a year, with the last big battle being fought in August of 1782 at a place called the Blue Licks in Kentucky. It was there a combined British and Native American force surprised the Kentucky militia. And one of the men leading that militia was none other than Daniel Boone, American pioneer and frontiersman whose exploits made him one of the first folk heroes of the United States. Even though the Americans were on the verge of victory in the 13 colonies, the British still controlled Canada and the Great Lakes region. Now a band of English Rangers under the command of Captain William Caldwell crossed the Ohio River and joined with natives in the area. Their hope was to draw as much of the Kentucky militia as possible into an ambush and destroy them. Caldwell's plan worked and secured a British victory, so it was in fact the British that won the last battle in the War of Independence. On the 3rd of September, 1783, Britain finally recognized the independence of the 13 colonies, with the final British troops evacuating on the 25th of November that same year from New York to Halifax in Canada. So let's take a look at the 5 main reasons for the success of the colonists. 1. Foreign involvement. As we have said, the French and Spanish both gave support to the colonists, especially France. In fact, France was left hugely in debt after the war, so much so that it was a major contributor to causing the French Revolution in 1789. 2. Strict British supply lines. The British had a global empire, which meant that her army and navy were spread around the globe and had to be largely kept in place to avoid any local trouble. And the 3,000 miles between the American colonies and Great Britain meant communication was delayed for weeks, as were supplies, such as weapons and troops. 3. British debt. The whole reason the British taxed the colonies in the first place was to claw back money spent after the 7 Years' War with the French. This war left Britain hugely in debt, which certainly played against them in just about every aspect of the war. 4. Familiarity. The colonists were fighting on home ground and knew the land they were fighting on giving them a huge advantage. The majority of British troops were drafted in and knew very little about North America. 5. Hearts and minds. The colonists were fighting for something incredibly important: freedom. There is no doubt that the colonists were inspired and fought harder than the British troops who were far away from home. The inspiration and great thinking that won the war continued on in the building of the nation and helped the United States become the great nation it is today. Ever since the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, the U.S. has seen phenomenal growth, and today it continues to uphold the basic freedoms that the Western world holds dear.
Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Please like and subscribe.